Hey, good evening, baseball fans. Play ball. Very excited about today's announcement that we're going to have a Major League Baseball season this year. So I couldn't not make a video this evening. I was very excited to kind of figure out what did I want to put out tonight. What did I want to do to kind of celebrate that we actually have a season ahead of us now. Now I know there's still many things that are still unresolved between the owners and players, and we're still probably far from labor peace in this world, but we have games coming up starting April 7th, so I'm really excited. And as a White Sox fan, we had a pretty good team. I've been in the playoffs the last 2 years, so hopefully it can only get better this season. We can actually advance in the playoffs and maybe move past the second or the first round of the playoffs and get into the American League Championship Series and maybe beyond if need be. So either way, I'm looking forward to a pretty exciting season. Tonight I'm going to be doing something a little bit different. I've talked previously about some other interest I had as I've been able to showcase Minoso, Nelly Fox, and talk briefly about Curt Flood last week. This week I want to talk a little bit about something that actually has been part of my interest in the hobby since I began, which is building sets. Like many set collectors, that's kind of been an on and off hobby throughout my life. The very first one I put together was the 1987 Topps baseball set, and then it went a few years before I put any other additional sets together. I think I put together a few basketball sets in the early 90s, which I no longer have. When I got back into the hobby as a young adult, I started focusing on finishing off some of the sets that I had a lot of cards for. And my first vintage set I put together was 1973, which I'll show at some point. But tonight I actually wanted to pull out one of the more recent vintage sets that I completed. I'm still working on one project, which is something we can kind of review in another video. But I wanted to actually present tonight the set that actually changed the design of baseball cards forever when it was released back in 1957. So actually going to be showing the 1957 Topps set. So I'm slowly going to open it up, try not to hit the camera while I do that. Hopefully this is a good angle for everybody to be able to see the cards. I'm move it centered a little bit more. I'm going to go through and show you some of the pages. We'll kind of go through the entirety of the set. It's not a long set. I believe it's just a 407 card set, which at that point was the largest set to date that Topps had produced. What was different about this set, this was the second year that they were doing it all on their own, meaning they didn't have competition from Bowman at that point. Was the big innovation was two things, one of which was the size of the cards. Obviously the larger cards that were released by Topps through the early 50s, and some of the Bowmans that came a little bit later that were much larger than the cards that we now collect now. As you can remember, as a kid, we had a hard time being able to find good top loaders and things for some of those cards because of the size. So the current size of 2.5 inches by 3.5 inches started with the 1957 Topps set. So that was one of the big innovations that they did. And the second part was actually to have a full stat line on the back of the cards, which up to that point they hadn't done. When I say full stat line, they actually broke it down by each individual year. So that probably went into a lot of research being able to put that stuff together. So those are things we don't even really think about cards now, just because they're pretty commonplace, both the size of the cards and actually the stat line. But for them, they were innovations at that point into the card game. The set itself was released along several series, as many sets were through the 1950s all the way into the early 70s. What's different about the 57 set is not the last series, it's not the most difficult series to get, but it's the second to last series. And there's actually some key Hall of Fame cards that are in that series. So without further ado, I'm going to present to you the 1957 Topps set. A little caveat, at this time, Stan Musial still is out of contract with Topps, so he won't have a card in here. So it is missing some key stars, also like Harmon Killebrew did not have a card in the 1957 Topps set. He wouldn't appear back in a set until the 1958 Topps set, which was also the first year that Stan Musial was featured. Also doesn't have Jackie Robinson because he just retired at the previous season at the end of it, so he didn't make the cutoff line to be in spring training and get a card that year. So it's still missing some of the key names from the 1950s, but for the most part, it still has the largest stars outside of probably the ones that I mentioned. All right, so I think the very first 1957 Topps card I got was newly elected Hall of Famer Gil Hodges. And from that point on, as I got a little bit older into the hobby and I got back into it for a third time, I wanted to be able to start working on the 1957 Topps set. All right, so 1957 Topps set leads off with Ted Williams You can't get much more classic and vintage than Teddy Ball Game. So that card is actually comes with a bit of a premium just because it often wasn't in good condition because it was the first card in the set. Obviously, that's a theme you'll see throughout. It's probably the 40s, 50s, and into the 60s, as people would put that card on the top of their pile and would wrap it up with a rubber band, and we just get dinged left and right. So my Ted Williams actually has got a little paper loss up in the corner. But other than that, it's still a pretty solid image of Ted Williams. This page is pretty cool because it's got a couple different Hall of Famers on it. I'll kind of point them out as we go through. We got Yogi Berra as the second card in the set. Luis Aparicio, which was his second card. Then on to this first series, has most of the Hall of Famers in it. So if you're looking to be able to just collect Hall of Famers from the set, you're going to get mostly first series cards. The second page obviously has Willie Mays, had Robin Roberts, the rookie card for Don Drysdale. Now my set's probably going to be rating out in the poor to fair range, which was fine by me because that's probably what I could easily afford and accommodate. This page, a few more Hall of Famers. The famous reverse image of Hank Aaron, which was never corrected. So even though it's an error, it's an uncorrected error, so it's not any more rare because there wasn't a corrected version that came out. I think we all know that Hank Aaron was not a left-handed batter. We got Whitey Ford down in the corner, Bill Mazzarovsky rookie card. It's actually one of the few Hall of Famers from the set that's still alive. We got Whitey Herzog, who's a Hall of Fame manager, up at the top there next to Pee Wee Reese, which is his second to last card. We have the Hall of Fame rookie card of Frank Robinson, when he played for Cincinnati before he got traded over to the Baltimore Orioles in the 1960s. Frank Torrey, the older brother of Joe Torre. Nellie Fox, White Sox second baseman. Early Wynn, Hall of Fame pitcher who also pitched for the White Sox and was part of the Go-Go White Sox later on. Carlo Ferrullo, obviously not a Hall of Famer, but a pretty famous Brooklyn Dodger. Hall of Famers on this page, but kind of let you enjoy them. Add things where you have them. A few more Hall of Famers on this page and players of note. Ernie Banks, obviously Mr. Cub up there in the corner. Dick Williams, Hall of Fame manager. Billy Martin, not in the Hall of Fame, but pretty notorious and pretty famous throughout baseball history for a lot of his antics off the field as well as on the field as a manager. Richie Ashburn in the corner. Chico Carousel used to play for the White Sox before he got traded to the Cleveland Indians. You see some of my cards are not in the best condition. See this one I think was in an album, so it got ripped out when we pulled the card out back in the day whenever that was removed. So there's the first one I got, Gil Hodges, as I mentioned. I probably got that back in the late 90s. Pretty cheap. I think at that point I was still learning about Hall of Famers and I didn't know he wasn't a Hall of Famer, but was a name I recognized. So that's why I picked it up. Later found out he wasn't a Hall of Famer and later obviously was able to get it. Jimmy Parasol is a pretty famous guy locally just because of television and radio broadcasts that he did. I believe mostly with the White Sox when he was actually broadcasting along Harry Carey back in the late 70s and early 80s before Harry Carey went over to the Cubs. Obviously, Roberto Clemente. It's one of my favorite cards in the set. Larry Doby. It's actually the first African-American manager for the White Sox. Warren Spahn down in the corner. Actually ending the year, getting near the end of the first series. Right smack dab in the middle, Mickey Mantle. One of the more famous cards from the set. This one, some people don't like the image as much because it's so dark in the background. This was the first time Topps did all color photos. And unlike the Bowman color ones, where they really seem to take advantage of trying to take pictures that were against the sky and somehow featured lighter colors in the background to really kind of liven up the image by and large, Topps didn't seem to be as mindful with it, and sometimes a lot of these photos came out really dark. So you can see there's Mickey Mantle, even though he's at Yankee Stadium, probably during a day game. It's a pretty dark image when you kind of look at it. But it's still a pretty cool card, I think, just because you see the swing in there. And again, it was the first color image of a Topps card that was released. That wasn't like a painted image and things like that you saw in the previous editions. It wasn't obviously the first color photograph baseball card, because that goes back, I believe, to 1953 Bowman. That's obviously a pretty famous and expensive card. The team cards began to start making appearances in the second series and onward. Yeah, the presidents of the American National League cards, those were in the 50s for a few sets, and then they just discontinued them. I can't imagine it's a card probably anybody was really dying to get when they opened a pack and they're like, oh great, I have the National League and American League presidents, but I don't have a Mickey Mantle when they opened it up. The Milwaukee Braves. This season, actually, the Braves played the Yankees in the World Series. It's pretty cool. You got two brothers back-to-back. You got Cletus and Ken Boyer back-to-back in the set. That's pretty cool. I don't know where else you might see that throughout history, but I always thought that was kind of interesting as I was putting this set together. Mr. Tiger, Al Kaline down here at the bottom. That was also one of the first cards I think I got for this set. Up in the corner, Bob Lemon, another Hall of Fame pitcher. When I was showing this set to my dad, he actually had stories to tell about a lot of the players that are listed in here that I'm not as familiar with, just because he grew up with a lot of these guys, especially the St. Louis Cardinals, because that was his team. He had a lot of stories about players that either were playing for them or had played for them, which I thought was kind of interesting hearing him tell the stories. Don Newcomb, not a Hall of Fame player, but pretty famous pitcher for the Brooklyn Dodgers through the 1950s. Moose Gowan was a guy who became pretty famous here locally in Chicago after his career was over. Later played for the White Sox before he retired. One of the new Hall of Famers, Minnie Minoso, up here in the corner. I think Al Smith, if I remember correctly, someone probably could put it in the comments if I'm wrong, was the outfielder for the White Sox in the '59 World Series when the famous image of a soda or a beer getting dumped on him as a ball was going into the stands. I believe it was at the LA Coliseum and not at Wrigley Field, or not at Comiskey Park at that time. I believe that was Al Smith in that picture, if I'm not mistaken. Red Chandies, one of my dad's favorite players. First thing he said when he saw that card, he was in the wrong uniform. I'm like, well, in 1957, he wasn't in the wrong uniform. He was in the right uniform with the Giants. What's kind of cool about this one is the last year, I believe, that the Giants and also the Dodgers were in New York. So that kind of makes this set interesting as a piece, like a time capsule, if you will. Big Clue, Ted Kluski, not a Hall of Famer, but pretty famous player nevertheless. Duke Schneider. This one's not in the greatest condition. This one, someone taped this into their album back in the day. Kind of funny to think about it now, but that's how people sometimes people would organize their cards and tape them into binders. What we know now, that would be such a bad idea, but back then it made a lot of sense. Roger Craig, I remember him managing the Giants when I was a kid, when the Giants were playing the Cardinals in the 87 playoffs to get into the World Series. As I mentioned, my dad was a big Cardinal fan, so we were watching that series pretty intently, hoping the Cardinals would get in, which they did, but they lost to the Minnesota Twins. Tito Francona, dad of Terry. Hoyt Wilhelm, Hall of Fame reliever. Played for just about everybody in the world, including both Chicago baseball teams. Roy Campanella in the top corner there. The only Campanella card I own is part of this set, which is kind of true for a lot of the stars that are in here of this era. Rocky Calavita rookie card. Probably was a few good seasons away from being a Hall of Famer himself. He was quite the slugger during his time. Dina Slaughter, down here, Country Slaughter, when he was playing for the Yankees near the end of his career. George Kell, Hall of Fame third baseman and broadcaster for the Tigers after his retirement. I always thought he had a fun name, Smokey Burgess. Eddie Matthews, down here in the corner, Hall of Fame third baseman. Now we're getting into the short print series, which I think is the 4th series. I think there's 5 series in all. There's a few key cards in this one as we go through. Really big names. Don Zimmer is kind of a bigger name in the card in the set here. Wasn't his rookie card, but it was one of his first couple cards. Bobby Richardson rookie, that's a big one just because he was a big name for the Yankees. And the Yankees were obviously part of their dynasty during that time period. Yankee cards from this era are always come at a premium. Even if it's a minor player on the team, it still costs more than a player for like the Cincinnati Reds during the time. Here's our first Hall of Famer in this series, Sandy Koufax. It's the only Sandy Koufax I own. Tony Kubek is also another one that's a little bit more pricey. And some of these cards I was just happy to get them. So some of the condition's not great. As you can see, in this one's been run over by a truck a few times, it looks like, but it survived. Brooks Robinson, rookie card. That one also is seen a lot in its time. Just happy to pick it up and add it. Jim Bunning's rookie card. That's a pretty big one in this set right now, too. Obviously, later served as, I think, a U.S. senator, I believe, not a congressman. And it's going to be mostly comments from this point on as we go into the 5th and final series. I believe we're transitioning into that now. A lot of names that I don't know too much about. Guys that played for a few seasons here and there. Seem to be a theme of a lot of these cards for these next few pages. Jim Landis was not one of them. He was actually a pretty good player for the White Sox throughout the early parts of the 60s. Pizarro later went on to pitch for the White Sox. Chuck Tanner Obviously went on to be a pretty successful manager, also for the Pirates and for the White Sox. Now we're getting to the end of the set. This was also the first time they actually did a multiple player card. So you saw there's two in particular in here that you'll see right at the end. One of which being the Brooklyn Dodgers, and this one you have 3 Hall of Famers that are listed on there now, because you have Hodges, Campanella, and Schneider. And the final page, you can disregard the 1967 Topps cards, is the last 3 cards here at the top. Last one is the Yankee power hitter featuring Mickey Mantle and Yogi Berra. In case you're wondering why these other ones are there, that's the next set I'm working on. When that one's finished, I'll do a little something on that one. All right, that's it. I hope you enjoyed it. Feel free to leave a comment if you have any questions, especially if you want to talk about building any vintage sets. I'm happy to be able to be contacted and talk about that. Have a great night.